the shooting of evacuation columns.
They just started to shoot them with guns from tanks from the beginning.
Rapes and inhuman torture.
Они сказали, что сейчас привезут мою 17-летнюю дочь.
They said they would bring my 70-year-old daughter and they would untie my eyes and rape her. All this would be on my conscience. Atrocities of Russians in Ukraine, an order or a personal initiative. It is just this paradigm in their minds that is forcibly murderous to destroy. We must be destroyed by any means. Violence, trample morally, for example, to a lifetime.
Загадочная русская душа. Российская империя,
The
Советский Союз.
mysterious Russian soul, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union and now modern Russia created a myth about the unique features of Russians, a deeply moral and highly spiritual people. This myth appeared at the end of the 19th century and was cultivated by propaganda for more than a century. In February 2022, the world saw completely different Russians, sadists and executioners. Executions of civilians, torture of prisoners, rape of the elderly, women, children, and all these with the approval of the relatives of the occupiers. We want to understand why the myth turned out to be so far from reality. Why are the soldiers of the largest country on the Eurasian continent so cruel? Do you remember you killed somewhere 4 or 5 people? Did they fall down after you shot them?
They didn't fall. There were only pieces of their bodies. Almost of the beginning of Kherson city, human bodies were lying. Arms, legs, heads and body, everything separately. There were bodies lying on the road and we didn't even move them. I also participated in this. We tortured prisoners. On the human body you can make 21 roses, 20 fingers and a penis. Have you ever seen how a rose opens when it blooms? The same along the bones, the skin is cut off with meat. Interceptions of phone conversations between Russian soldiers and relatives in the first months of a full-scale war became a shock for everyone who had to listen to them, and shed light on the real intentions of the Kremlin. Not the mythical denazification or demilitarization that Russian propaganda used to justify the invasion of Ukraine, but the extermination of the nation sanctioned by the Kremlin, and the Russian soldiers tried their best to fulfill this installation. When they started shooting at the houses, we hid. Then it burned down. They shot into the wall and drove off. This is what happened on February the 27th, when Viktor Klemenko, a resident of the village of Andriivka, saw Russian soldiers. The Russians drove people out of their houses, or settled in those from which the residents were evacuated. They occupied Viktor Klemenko's basement. They moved mattresses and bedding from the house. The man and his wife were hiding in the neighbor's basement. The occupation of the village lasted 35 days. 35 days of fear and terror.
Вони шукали, хто служив в армії, хто був в АТО.
They were looking for those who served in the army, who was in the ATO zone. Checked, undressed the guys and looked for tattoos. One of the locals did not give tractor. They shot. The other was shot because they wanted to kill. My nephew with his friend was killed over there, at the collective farm. Before the full-scale invasion, more than 1,000 people lived in Andriivka. The occupation was fast. People didn't have time to evacuate. The terror began immediately. The Russians tortured and abused civilians. They executed 14 local residents. 3 more died as a result of shelling. Dozens are missing. Now Andriivka village resembles an unhealed wound. Most of the houses cannot be rebuilt, as they are destroyed and burned. In the rest, residents repair roofs, insert broken windows, remove facts of Russian occupation from the yards. But the memory left by the Russians cannot be changed so quickly.
A priest brought a girl, Dasha, 14 years old. She and her father with stepmother and grandfather were in a car in the center of the village. At that moment, Russians started to shoot with guns from tanks. Her grandfather covered Dasha with himself. They immediately killed dad and stepmother. He threw her out of the car and covered her with himself and asked to run. And when she crawled away, they shot at her and said, "Target." They shot her in the arms, in the legs. She crawled along the road and they just laughed.
This story is from Dimir, another village near Kiev. The methods were the same: executions of peaceful columns and a hunt for civilians. The same was in other villages of the Kiev region: Borodyanka, Hostomel, Irpin, Bucha. After the liberation of the latter, a horrifying picture opened up to the world. The streets were littered with the bodies of civilians. Many of them had their hands tied behind their backs. People were kidnapped, held captive and tortured. The holes in the walls are bullet holes. Of course, a primary inspection has already been carried out here. All material evidence has been seized. In this position, it was here that these people were tortured, put on their knees and simply shot. These people were horrified. It is awful, but a death saved them from torture. In the territories liberated from the Russians, Ukrainian law enforcement officers found more than 30 torture facilities. The same number of Russian invaders organized filtration camps. The bodies of those who did not survive the torture were thrown into mass graves by the Russians. In trenches, the Ukrainian military and law enforcement officers discovered the bodies of hundreds of men, women and children. There are no names on these graves, more often numbers, but sometimes not even them. The reaction to the situation in Bucha was immediate. The United States and European countries have increased sanctions against Russia, and the International Criminal Court started to investigate the atrocities of Russians in Ukraine.
This is not really a time for talking, it's a time for action.
It is time to act. International law cannot be a passive spectator. It must move with readiness to defend and insist on responsibility. The next day after I started the investigation, on March the 2nd, I sent a group to that region. I have been to Ukraine twice during this period, in Lviv and in Kiev. Bucha was in this list also. My team of analysts and forensic experts, anthropologists and lawyers visited other regions as well. The Russians committed atrocities in every captured city or village. The Ukrainian military liberated the territory of the Kharkiv region in September. Evidence of Russian atrocities is still being found. Oleg Digolo was abducted by the invaders from his own house. 20 Russian soldiers burst into the yard on the armored personal carrier. They took Oleg, his son and nephew. The men were forced into a car, blindfolded and taken away in an unknown direction. Oleg was beaten and tortured for 8 days. They asked about the military service. The beating lasted for a long period of time. They made injections in the leg. They beat me. They told that I would be disabled and the arms of the leg would be cut off. Later it turned out that all the men were kept at the railway station of the village of Kozachalopan, where the Russians made a torture chamber. The occupiers had different reasons for torture. Sometimes they beat and blackmailed for no reason. They said they would bring my 70-year-old daughter and they would untie my eyes and rape her. All this would be on my conscience. Such cruelty is definitely not amateur performance, psychologists are sure. This happens either with the consent of the military leadership or by order. If they did it, then they had an order of their command, I think, led by their most important supreme commander.
уничтожение народа. Ничто иное.
This is the genocide of people, nothing else. Not the destruction of gangs, but the whole people. There is not a single militant in this area. There is simply the genocide of the Chechen people. Not much.
What have you done? You destroyed the whole nation.
300,000 civilians killed, including 40,000 children. Cities and villages are destroyed. Even 13 years after the end of the Second Russian-Chechen War, the crimes of the Russians were not forgotten.
Знаете, когда-то нам показывали...
You know, once we were shown the Germans in various Soviet films, how they committed atrocities against the civilian population. In reality, it was much worse. Imagine, the women, children, old people were killed. Terror of the population was the main method of the Kremlin in the Russian-Chechen War. Air raids and bombardments of cities, mass executions, abductions of people. The Russians created almost 1,000 filtration camps in Chechnya and beyond. The most famous is the Chernokozovo death camp. Here is the testimony of one of the prisoners. Torture was carried out by 48 contract soldiers who came from Rostov, Volgograd and Vladikavkaz. Beatings and rape were most common sin. Among the prisoners there were a 10-year-old boy and his 30-year-old sister. The boy was beaten and the girl was raped. The mother and two daughters of one of the detained women managed to get a visit to her for 5,000 rubles. The meeting lasted 5 minutes, after which the mother and one of the daughters of the detainee were sent back. The eldest daughter, a 40-year-old girl, was detained. She was beaten and raped for 4 days in a row. Russia has never been punished for the crimes in Chechnya. In order to justify the atrocities, the propaganda machine worked at full.
Они назвали нас бандитами во время первой русско-чеченской.
They called us bandits during the First Chechen War and quoted their imposed war as establishing constitutional order. Then they called us even worse, Islamic radicals, Islamic terrorists.
Why do not they see? Putin does not see all this. Their kids, grandchildren, why do not they see them? Because they do not see this war, this bombing.
Дискредитация противника. Этот прием российская пропаганда использовала в каждой войне.
Discrediting the enemy. The Russian propaganda used this technique in every war. Thus, it tried to justify such aggression. First of all, in the eyes of the world community. The internal consumers did not delve into the details. In fact, a couple of statements by the Kremlin officials were enough. And the Russians began to believe, first in the Islamic radicals in Chechnya, then in the Nazis in Ukraine. And not just believe, but demand more and more blood. Just rape Ukrainian women and don't tell me anything, understand? So that I don't know anything. Do not forget the protection.
This phone conversation between Russian soldier Roman Bykovsky and his wife Olga Bykovskaya was intercepted by the Security Service of Ukraine in mid-April. The woman laughs, allowing her husband to rape Ukrainian women. At the same time, Ukrainian and international investigators are documenting numerous cases of sexual violence by Russian soldiers.
В Російській Федерації оця огульна гебельська пропаганда.
In the Russian Federation, the sweeping Goebbels propaganda showed Ukrainians as a non-people, the Ukrainian state as a non-state, and so on. The same propaganda worked in Nazi Germany, for example with the Jews, plus Russian despotism, which lasted for several hundred years. Ukraine called on the UN and other international organizations to investigate the facts of violence. Such cases, dozens if not hundreds, because often the victims prefer to keep silent about violence. Someone doesn't want to remember the horrors, someone is ashamed. This woman didn't remain silent. Her daughter was raped by a Russian military man.
He dragged her into a classroom on the second floor, raped her all night, injected drugs, said she would feel nothing. He cut her cheek and neck, he raped her, wanted to kill her.
Psychologist Yuri Irkin believes that the rapes of civilians by Russian invaders are deliberate and purposeful and are not random incidents. This is just part of the terror machine.
It
is just this paradigm in their minds that is forcibly murderous to destroy. We must be destroyed by any means. Violence. Trample morally, for example, to a lifetime. Therefore, any sane person in the 21st century knows that sexual abuse is a hyper-traumatic situation.
Если жестокость российских солдат можно
If
еще...
the cruelty of Russian soldiers can still be somehow explained, not understood and accepted but explained, by pumping up propaganda, ideology orders, then why are civilians so thirsty for blood? They approve the atrocities in Ukraine, and it shocks even psychologists.
Морально людей просто двумя словами. Тебе так нравится?
If I got there, I would also mock. You and I are the same.
Violence is in all spheres of peaceful Russian life. At home, on vacation, at work. Assault is the main argument of Russians in any disputes.
Это была защита, просто. Я тебе дам еще раз, ты умер, блядь, дурак, блядь.
It is easy to explain this phenomenon. People surrounded by violence inevitably begin to perceive it as the norm, especially if the child grows up in a family where assault is a common sin.
Вышел закон, который...
As you know, a law was passed according to which if a husband beats his wife, then this is not a criminal offense. This is common for dysfunctional families. That's when I was growing up. I was born and raised in Russia. I just remember what happened with the neighbors and in the family. And it's practically daily quarrels. They are constantly fighting with each other. The circumstances in which the majority of Russians live also have an effect. Lack of education, beggarly living conditions, houses without basic amenities, sewerage, water supply, the internet. Many citizens of the great gas state do not even have centralized heating. This is how the village of Novokurayanova exists at 30 kilometers from Moscow. They heat with firewood and cook on stoves.
Moscow residents live in their manner. It is really difficult. I can show you how we take a bath in the trough.
No matter how much Kremlin propaganda tries to show the world a prosperous Russia, people outside of Moscow, St. Petersburg and several other large cities don't live but survive.
Если взять, например, город Рубцовск.
If we take, for example, the city of Rubtsovsk in the Altai, there are 4 penal colonies, and moreover, soldiers who committed crimes in Bucha were from this city. Russian penal colonies are a torture conveyor. Accordingly, those people who work there, they also bring up those people who then join the army and go to Ukraine to kill civilians. The Putin regime is quite satisfied with this state of affairs. Hardened by poverty, people are ready to pounce on each other if such an order comes from the Kremlin. It is proven by Soviet dictators.
Постійно було рабство в різних формах.
They always had slavery in various forms, in the special services, in the punitive organs of the Soviet Union, which carried out repressions. We are talking about the Extraordinary Commission, the State Political Administration, then the NKVD. Somewhere between 2 and 3% had higher education. And on such a plebs, on such people, the Soviet government, now the Russian Federation, has always stalked. And on such plebs, on such people, the Soviet government, now the Russian Federation, has always staked. Such people have a very low moral standard, knowing their upbringing.
Фашисты будущего будут...
The fascists of the future will call themselves anti-fascist. This phrase is attributed to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Whether he said it, historians are still arguing. One thing is clear. Those who for decades attributed to themselves the image of the winner of the Nazis repeat their worst crimes.
To get rid of this cruelty, sadism and desire to destroy everyone, the Russians can only be punished for their atrocities. And the mechanisms for this are already working. The International Criminal Court is investigating Russian crimes.
Physically bringing these people to justice is also the main task in order to bring those responsible. It will be necessary either something to be changed in Russia. These people are extradited to those courts that handle such cases, or they leave Russia. Here it is very important that there are a sufficient number of international warrants for arrest, so that they are executed by those countries to which Russians can theoretically go. Ukraine is also conducting its own investigation. Law enforcement agencies have opened more than 40,000 criminal proceedings against the Russian military, And these are not nameless soldiers. 168,000 invaders have already been identified. Names, ranks, places of service, data of relatives. And justice, even after decades, will overtake everyone. Ксенія Барвіненко, Діана Колесник, Павло Штельмах, specially for UATV News.